welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for another one of our Canadian business history talks. We are recording this session, so you know, for posterity, for historical purposes. And if, as a result of that, if you can please keep your microphones on mute, we will, after Tom and I talk for 35 minutes, 40 minutes or so, we will open it up to Q&A for 20 or so minutes for the rest of the hour. And please enter your questions in the chat function, and I'll get to as many as possible when we get there. So I want to also, as we begin here, to give hearty thanks to our dedicated sponsor, National Bank Financial. We couldn't do these talks without you, so thanks so much for that. And also to all the folks at the CBHA-ACHA, en français, for keeping the discussion of Canadian business history alive and well. And we are very, very fortunate and lucky to have today somebody who has literally lived Canadian business history, modern business history, shall we say, and that is Tom D'Aquino, who for 28 years, which is a heck of a long time, was CEO of the Business Council on National Issues, which later became the Canadian Council of CEOs, and is now known as the Business Council of Canada. And whatever the name, the council is undoubtedly the premier business lobby group in the country. And over the course of his tenure, Tom has worked astonishingly with some 1,000 CEOs. That's a staggering number. I mean, we know they come and go, but that is still a staggering number, 1,000 business leaders, not to mention world leaders. And every Canadian prime minister, by my count, since Pierre Trudeau through Stephen Harper, and of course knows Justin. But I should also add that at university, he even roomed with a future Canadian Prime Minister, that was Joe Clark. In any case, his role at the council put him at center ice, I should say, among other things, free trade negotiations, the deficit fights of the 1990s, fallout from 9/11, and the 2008 financial crisis, constitutional crises as well. For sure, Tom has had his critics. He was dubbed the de facto prime minister by some, wielding what they thought was excessive power as the voice of big business. But few, I would say, have observed the breadth of leaders that he has worked alongside. And it's undeniable that he's been a central figure in Canadian public and economic policy. And Tom is the author of the best-selling book, Private Power, Public Purpose, and he is our guest today. Great to have you with us, Tom. Thanks for making time.
Great pleasure to be with you. Also a best-selling author.
Well, we won't get into that, but this is all about you today. So, you know, I want to start first of all with your early days, because your family has a powerful story, an immigrant story. Tell us a bit about your early days and how that shaped you and what lay ahead for you. And we'll get to the Business Council and the issues in a minute, but first let's start with that.
Great, Howard. Well, like so many of us in Canada, and in fact, all of us, if you really do the big count, all came from somewhere, all came from immigrant families at one point. My father was not someone who was eager to leave his homeland, which was Italy, but he happened to be serving in what was then known as the as a paramilitary force just at the end of the First World War, and there was great chaos in the country. Communists and fascists were fighting it out, and he and his family and ancestors were great supporters of monarchy. And he just thought, this is not a very good place to be, and came to Canada. And that was a great fortune for me. He went out west. He heard that there was a mini gold rush going on there, and I married my mother, who was also from Italy. She grew up in the marvelous, that marvelous part of Italy that we all know as Tuscany. I was born, grew up in a very conservative family, and but one in which values were deemed to be extremely important. But one of the overriding things that it taught me, Howard, was the value of the rule of law and living in a democracy. And for any of you who have taken the time to read my book, you'll see that that idea sort of permeates right through my writing, because we're very fortunate to live in Canada. It's not a perfect country, one of the best countries in the world, but those values that they gave me were, in addition to hard work, being ambitious, commitment to excellence, all those things that we, at least most of us, like to think are desirable.
So rule of law and democracy still very top of mind these days with what's going on in so many countries. And obviously you can't have the underpinning for a successful society or business community for that matter without it. But you got some early lessons in democracy, because another one of your formative experiences was going to work in Ottawa for the first Trudeau, who was prime minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in the late 60s, early 70s. What did that teach you that you took with you to this other work as you went on to the business community later?
Well, first of all, Howard, it taught me, having the privilege of being at the apex of power, which is where the prime minister is, and my office, and I was a pretty junior guy. I was a pretty young man in those days, but my office was just down the hall in the East Block from his East Block office. And it was a wonderful time in Canadian public life, often referred to as Camelot North, because you had this philosopher king of a prime minister, a man who was in many respects an intellectual giant, who came to office on a huge, I would say unprecedented wave of popularity. And he also came with some very strong ideas, which led to, for example, the constitutional reforms, the Charter of Rights, which fundamentally changed Canada, the patriation of the Constitution. In many respects, Pierre Trudeau was a great constitutional thinker. And those early days that I worked with him was a time when so many young people wanted to be in government, because that was the place to be. It was a place where the brightest and the best were. Exciting things were happening. It was on the tail end of quite a revolution that was taking place in North America. You know what was happening in the United States at that time. So I can't think, I've said this again and again, if I had to pick 4 years in the last 100 to have served in government, those would be the 4 years that I would have picked.
That's fascinating, because there's also an irony in this, because many people in the business community had a view that Pierre Trudeau was not supportive of them, and which brings me to the genesis of the Business Council on National Issues, which seemed, from what you wrote, to form because of certain things that had gone on during Trudeau's days in power. Can you tell us about the formation of the BCNI and why it came into existence?
Absolutely. One of the things that acted as a catalyst is that Prime Minister Trudeau introduced wage and price controls. This is after having campaigned against the idea, and to the unfortunate Robert Stanfield, who had originally proposed it. And that degree of intervention, which was later played out in policies such as the National Energy Program, was deemed by the captains of industry at the time to be really quite interventionist. But the business community collectively did not have a traditional engagement public policy in those days. And so the original thinking behind it was, yes, we have a Canadian Manufacturers Association in Canada. It's been around for a long time, Canadian Chamber of Commerce. But what we really need is a group of CEOs who can come together and see if they can come up with a unified approach to dealing with some of the great big public policy issues. So initially, it was the idea of a man that you knew, Alfred Powers, long associated with Noranda, and a fellow called Bill Thwaites, who was the CEO of Imperial Oil. And they thought, let's put this together, and got together. This is in the late 70s. invited a number of other CEOs to come to the table. And in a relatively short period of time, it started with 12, then it became 20, then it became 60. And in those days, I was a young lawyer. I had my own practice, but I was also special advisor to the nascent Business Council. And, but as I looked at it, I could see that it wasn't really, it was difficult for them to sort of pull it together because they had never done this before. And I proposed a very radical plan to them, and that is that they come together in a very serious, that they appoint me as CEO.
Bold.
Sounds somewhat self-serving, and at the time it was, but I was really trying to be of help. And that as an organization, we should be driven by the power of our ideas. In other words, we shouldn't be strong because we commanded a great amount of assets in those days, which were in the billions already, but because we had something really important to contribute to the country. Initially, my ideas were deemed to be somewhat radical, but the original group that came together were not taken with what I was proposing, and I was hired to become CEO. And then the rest is history.
Well, you do say in your book you thought you might be fired for putting that for, but I guess it worked out. But you know, I want to jump ahead because there are so many interesting issues with which you dealt at the council. I mentioned a few in the introduction, and one of them, obviously, that came not that long after, were the negotiations and the subsequent agreement, the free trade agreement, which you call the most important economic initiative of Canada's post-war era. And why do you say that?
I say that because when the rumblings of the idea began, incidentally strongly opposed by the national political parties, there wasn't a single political party that favored the idea of a free trade agreement with the United States. The view was, it's roughly 10 times bigger than we are. How can we possibly negotiate a deal that's going to be to our advantage or to give us some advantages? So I began that process, initially trying to win over our own CEOs who thought that they couldn't compete, particularly those in the manufacturing sector. Those in the resource sector were more comfortable with the idea. And but with a long-term plan in mind that we actually negotiate a free trade agreement. And with a very dedicated staff, we went to work on this in the very early 1980s, and began a thing that culminated in 1988 with the federal election, with Brian Mulroney as prime minister, who had adopted the idea back in the autumn of '84, followed by the Shamrock Summit. And the reason why this was huge is because it fundamentally changed the thinking of the Canadian CEO community. So it tended to be protectionist, inward-looking, and they came to believe that if we want to succeed, we have to succeed in North America, the most competitive market in the world. And if we succeed in North America, we'll have a shot at being competitive in the world. And it wasn't just enterprises, it was also our workforce, Howard.
You know, you mentioned that none of the major Canadian political parties were initially in favor of this, including Brian Mulroney. Along came Donald McDonald's report, which pushed for a leap of faith on it, among other things, and what you were talking about as well. But the United States wasn't initially, or there was some question as to whether they would be as interested either, because you write about a meeting, a 1-hour meeting you had with then Vice President George H.W. Bush in Ottawa, and you asked him what he thought about free trade. Tell us what he said.
Well, it was one of those rare occasions, up until that time it never happened, where a member of the administration, in this case, the Vice President of the United States, came to Ottawa for the day. And I managed, through working with the American ambassador, to get a little bit of an hour plus. And we met privately at the Chateau Laurier, just next door. And at that meeting, I put on the table the idea, what do you think, Mr. Vice President, of a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. Incidentally, it's something that in very general terms had been talked about by his own president, Ronald Reagan. And his immediate response was, I'd never really thought about that. He turned to the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Martin Friedman,
Feldstein? Martin Feldstein.
Feldstein, forgive me. I had Friedman on the mind.
Yeah.
And he said, we should really give this a look-see. So that was the initial, but at that time as well, our outreach to American CEOs was not terribly encouraging. I mean, they sort of said, well, Canada, we don't have a problem with Canada, do we? I mean, you're on our northern border. It's the Japanese we have to worry about, the Europeans. That's where the action is. So it required a lot of work, first with our own community, then getting the national political parties. The NDP was never really on board, but to get the Conservative Party on board through Brian Mulroney, and then building support both within Canada and in the United States for this. So by the time we got to 86, 87, 88, and a very corrosive, highly divisive election, we were on the winning ticket. And even though John Turner, who at the time was a friend of mine, and our relationship with him was broken over it, we were always a nonpartisan organization. But the Liberals, as you know, were very strongly opposed. Mulroney won that election, although many people thought he wasn't going to win it because of the free trade agreement, and it was signed into law. And of course, the benefits have been enormous, huge. I mean, in econometric terms, if you look at our corporations today, where they're invested, if you look at the competitiveness of our workforce, obviously the free trade agreement was huge. And I consider that the single most important achievement of the Business Council, along with a successful campaign to help convince Canadians and Canadian leaders that we also had to run a very tight, strong fiscal ship.
But there's so much more to talk about. I know we want to get to some other things, but this was a very rocky road, as you've indicated. I mean, you write about a dinner in Washington in 1987 with Alan Gottlieb, then ambassador, all of your CEOs, Peter Lougheed, Donald McDonald, and Alan Gottlieb said, don't push the US. And Donald McDonald said, God damn it, Alan, whose side are you on? I mean, even our side was fighting. And then after you were burned in effigy.
I was burned in effigy right in front of the Chateau Laurier. I had a truckload of cow dung dumped on my driveway, and of course got a good collection of death threats in the meantime. It was, if you'll remember, and those of you who have that good recollection of that time and the election, it was very corrosive. People were really, really ginned up about it.
I want to bring up some of the criticisms that I alluded to in the introduction, Tom. Peter C. Newman, in his book Titans, said you were the most powerful influence on public policy formation in Canadian history, which you said was grossly exaggerated.
It was not helpful for me. It was helpful.
but he wasn't the only one. I mean, Canadian Forum called you the de facto PM, but Gordon Robertson, who was clerk of the Privy Council, said you're just too darn powerful, tone it down. And even Alf Powis, who was one of the founding CEOs, wanted to know whether you were proposing a shadow government. Did you ever have self-doubt about what you were doing?
I never had any doubts, Howard, about the direction and the policies that we were pursuing. But I certainly had a lot of sleepless nights about the degree of animosity and that came particularly from the left. But when we say the left, I mean the Liberal Party was very much opposed. And at that particular time, the Business Council, because of its work on competitiveness, on the competition policy, on deficits and debt, free trade, the GST, was just seen by too many people. These are all areas in which we played a leading role. It's just simply too powerful. And Gordon Robertson, who was a dear friend and a mentor of mine, you have no idea how shaken up I was when he invited me over one day for a cup of coffee. And I had no idea why I was going to his house. And he said, Tom, you're too darn powerful. You've got to tone it down. because he thought it was doing, apart from engendering opposition to the Business Council, it was also damaging my reputation. He was concerned about that. So all I'm really saying is that these council victories did not come without some pain associated with it, and I still have the scars on my back from some of those campaigns. But it was worth it, because at the end of the day, that's why the title of the book is Private Power, Public Purpose. At the end of the day, from day one, I was driven by the idea that powerful people, for good or for evil, but if they're for good, you can achieve good things. And that was the basis of the new Business Council.
Before we move on, I just want to make sure nobody's got their microphones on, because I'm seeing some things happen. If you can,
Jim,
please mute your microphone.
sorry. No, it's
Thank
nothing important.
Please,
When you finished all the work, did you ever have trouble closing the deal?
please
It's
turn your microphones off. We're not ready for questions yet. I should.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just missed the question. I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, well, we get to it. We'll get to it. I should say that it wasn't just from the Liberals. Mulrooney's group was also pretty critical of you at times too. Bill Fox apparently wanted to rip your heart out, quote unquote, as a result of the proposed changes to the OAS, and Paul Tellier told you it was known as the Tom DeCino tax, but we won't go too far down those roads. But I did want to mention that it was coming at you from all sides. And I want to move to NAFTA because that was the next logical step in the trade story. But Mexico, you write, approached you.
Right, they did. First of all, the idea of Mexico being a part of a North American Free Trade Agreement was so outlandish at the time. Why? Mexico was a relatively poor country. It was a country that had a terrible record in its relationship with the United States of America. Politically, the idea of getting in bed with the Americans was an idea that was truly revolutionary. And the new president of Mexico, Salinas, an Ivy League trained individual with a very bright cabinet around him, decided, why don't we join the free trade agreement? Talked to President Bush, this is George H.W. Bush, proposed the idea. And at first, Canada was not keen on the idea because we saw this as potentially watering down what we had worked so hard to conclude. But when Prime Minister Mulroney and President Bush spoke, and it became clear that President Bush wanted to go ahead with this, Brian Mulroney, of course, went along with it as well. But the role that we played in the Business Council was through the entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial class in Mexico, enormously powerful then and still powerful to this day. And they are the ones who said, if you succeeded in doing this with the Americans, there must be something in it for you. So tell us all about it. So that began a dialogue with the Mexicans, in which I say in my book, we were really quite influential in bringing them along. And those relationships are very strong to this very day with Mexico.
And we see that with this latest rail deal, actually, CP and Kansas City Southern, the first three-country railroad in North America. I want to come back to some of the questions that are floating around today, because as you well know better than I, in certain quarters, NAFTA is a dirty word. If you were a factory worker in Ohio, NAFTA for many of them was a dirty word, and many political observers say that Clinton, who finished George H.W. Bush's work on NAFTA, really, by signing that was the end of the working, or beginning of the end of the working class supporting the Democrats, and those observers say they've gone to people like Trump. And the other question associated with this is, did Reaganism and the trickle-down theory foretell the kind of income and wealth inequality that we're seeing these days, which is tied to that other issue that I mentioned? And I want to ask you, in the context of those observations, do you have any reservations about what may be unintended consequences or byproducts of all of this in the current economic and political dynamic that we're experiencing now?
Howard, if one looks at the trajectory of United States economic growth and United States economic performance, there was a lead editorial, I think 3 issues ago, excellent editorial in The Economist, which made the point that the US economy continues to fire on all pistons. The US innovation, competitiveness are still, they are still leaders in the world. So, and that the US workforce is much more competitive now than it was then. You can make some of the same arguments in the case of Canada, except that I would argue that GDP growth on a per capita basis in Canada has not been what it should be. However, if you then look at the number of Canadian corporations that are global today, as opposed to in '88, if you look at the number, how our workforce, where there's huge demand for skilled labor, how our workforce today is much more competitive globally than it was then, you would have to conclude that it was the deal, the first deal and the second deal, the NAFTA deal, was beneficial. I would say only this, though. My big disappointment, and I voiced this disappointment in Washington when I was there for 3 days last week, is that the original idea behind the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is that the United States, Canada, and Mexico would combine their populations, their resources, their human capital, and if we could work closely together, we could be the most dynamic economic region in the world for a long, long time to come. So my disappointment is that while we've gone down the road of the CUSMA or the USMCA, call it whatever you may, that degree of trilateral cooperation has not achieved the zenith that I would want it to. And if our leaders could wake up to make it happen, we could, in my view, easily be in a position as a region to be competitive with China, India, and many other parts of the world. It's just that that is still unfinished business.
It actually raises the question, Tom, about productivity, which is something that your organization and successively called organizations, now the Business Council of Canada, others in business talk about frequently, and that's our productivity level here in Canada. Why haven't we been able to move the dial on productivity? Why is it still something that we have to be talked to about in this country?
Howard, for those who take the time to read the book, one of the themes throughout it is the aspirations to achieve better economic growth, more innovation, higher productivity. For example, there's a chapter there that talks. It's quite a long chapter that talks about building a Canada that is a global leader. The aspirations behind that, which started in about 2000, built on strong fiscal foundation, free trade, an openness, an immigration system that brought very many talented people, access to the most important market in the world. And the theory or the thesis behind that would be that would also contribute to higher levels of productivity and growth. My one disappointment, and I mentioned this in the epilogue to my book, is that level of growth that I had hoped for has not materialized. Now, there are a whole series of reasons why not. One is we have had governments that have been interventionists. We've had some members of our business community that have not been sufficiently entrepreneurial. We've had tons and tons of paper on how we can be more innovative and strategies for doing so that simply repeat themselves over and over again, and we just simply don't fulfill them. And I boil it down at the very last words of the chapter that part of the reason is what I call complacency. When you're a country that is so well endowed with human talent, natural resources, security, we can go to bed at night not worrying about whether we're going to be invaded. When you have that degree of when you have that degree of being able to make it through a day, make it through a week, and do quite all right, it does something called complacency. And in my view, it's the complacency that has made us, that has prevented us from reaching out to what I call gold, and has made us a bronze performer. And what my book talks about is how do we beat this bag in order to achieve that? And that means being more entrepreneurial, be more daring, getting governments out of the way. Why does it take 8 years to permit a major investment in Northern Canada when that capital will very quickly go to somewhere else in the world where they don't have these permitting requirements? So it's not a single thing, but it means that we all have to row in the same way, in the same boat, if we want to aspire to achieving that gold status. In my view, it is attainable, but we just have to be a bit more daring and less complacent.
I'd like to have a long lunch with you to talk about this a little bit more, because what goes on in the States, we're often compared to the States. We're not good enough compared to the States, but then we see the financial crisis occurred there. We're looking at the debt ceiling there. So there's so much to discuss. But it brings up the current situation. We're facing great deficits in this country now, coming out of the pandemic. And of course, during your tenure at the council, we faced them big time in the 1990s, and the Chrétien-Martin government went after them quite successfully. You were a little bit on the inside there, according to what you wrote, going back to Davos in 1995, sitting with Peter Munk and George Soros there, and writing a note on you wrote a note on a napkin, did you, to Prime Minister Martin? About the deficit?
He was Finance Minister Martin.
Oh, he was the finance minister. That's right. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Oh, that's right. So here we were, Peter Munk every year at Davos used to always have a concluding lunch up at his chalet, and used to invite an eclectic mix of leaders. But on this particular occasion, the day before, 2 days before, the Wall Street Journal had come out with an editorial referring to Canada as the Northern Peso. And that's when we were really in serious trouble fiscally. So that particular night at dinner, George Soros asked me, where do you think the economy is going to go in Canada? And I said to him, I would not want to have a discussion of that kind with a man who bet against the Bank of England. But in the process of that discussion, we said, Canada is very much going in the wrong direction. Unless we solve this fiscal crisis, we're on our way to ruin. So we actually sat down and jotted a message to Finance Minister Martin. In those days, there was no such thing as the internet. And I dictated it over the telephone to my assistant in Ottawa. She typed it up and sent it over to Finance Minister Martin's office. And I'm not claiming that it was because of our note, but the next budget was his come hell or high water budget, where he, with the strong support of Prime Minister Chrétien, literally slew the deficit. And that created the circumstances for at least 10 years of surpluses in Canada, which combined with free trade put us in a very virtuous position economically.
Briefly, before I move to the last few things, because we want to get to the Q&A, what can we take from that experience, given what we're facing now? I mean, we have a whole different set of circumstances, obviously, but, in the early 80s, we had very high inflation, very high interest rates. Now we have climate change as a new overlay, perhaps the most important issue, an existential issue. What should we take from the 90s deficit fighting to dealing with the kind of deficits we have today?
Well, number one, if we're going to go in a direction which will give us higher growth, be able to realistically deal with our climate goals, and at the same time bring the deficit down, which in turn will help deal with inflation, we have to do it together. And right now, I see a Canada that's too divided. The partisan conflict that I see now is the sharpest that I have seen since all the days that I've had in being involved or watching federal politics. That's not helpful. Some of it imported from the United States, which again is not helpful. Incidentally, the Great Republic is what keeps me awake at night, because I think the dysfunction there is so serious. But it means we have to roll in the same direction. And that means having a clear idea on goals, accepting the many excellent ideas, whether it's the reform of healthcare, how we deal realistically with climate change, how we can make the reconciliation with Indigenous people work more effectively, as opposed to just simply being an enormous drain on money. This requires a country that is moving together in the same direction. I mean, getting an agreement on permitting, for example. When I'm told, yeah, we'll do something about permitting, it was mentioned in the last budget, but it may take 4 or 5 years. We don't have 4 or 5 years. We're losing investment as we speak. So that's why I come back to complacency. If you say, look, we're faced with some major issues here, another of them being our pathetic abilities in the domain of defense. These require choices. It requires choices in terms of how you're going to spend money. It will require choices about taxation, but you have to move in the same direction. And so long as you have a country divided between East and West, or severely divided the way they are, that's going to hamper our ability to do it. But, and I say this to my business colleagues, it does leave open the opportunity for business leadership and other forms of leadership too, to jump in, because that's exactly what we did at the time of the GST, free trade, and the fiscal fight. We were not following governments, we were leading governments at that particular time. And we were able to engender a sufficient degree of support that things actually began to happen.
So, that you mentioned earlier, the United States, what's going on there keeps you up at night. You were CEO of the council when 9/11 occurred and the fallout afterwards, which we're still living with, obviously. And many in the business community wanted Canada to join the fight in Iraq. Chrétien said no, and you write quite candidly, to your credit, that you regret having supported it yourself. But then we had 2008, and I think it's fair to say that the business community missed 2008. It came, people knew things were getting too frothy, but nobody knew how it would end, or certainly, what would happen with Lehman, or a few people, I guess, Bear and so forth, AIG, and what came after. And now we're dealing with this dysfunction there south of the border that none of us have seen. I guess arguably what happened in the late 60s with the assassinations and the Tet Offensive and so forth. But the country ripping apart politically now is at least in my lifetime, I think, unprecedented. Yet they are our biggest defender, our biggest ally. They're our biggest trading partner. And we don't want to be the 51st state. So how do we continue to deal with that country? And you were just there in Washington last week. I mean, for a while we were looking to Asia, but now China, they're spying on us. Other parts of the world, it's awful what's going on. So how do we deal with the United States?
Accepting, number one, that we're joint. There's absolutely no, if the United States goes down, we go down. I mean, it's as simple as that. And as I often say to my business colleagues, if you had an 80% investment in a company, would you pour every conceivable intellectual, financial resource into protecting that 80% share in that particular company? You would. So in my view, we, to use Mulrooney's term, we came to the dance with America. That's where we are, and that's where we're going to be. And that means that, number one, coming back to this North American idea, we have to get, particularly the Americans, understanding that if we work together as a continent, both in security terms and economic terms, resource development terms, innovation, artificial intelligence, we're going to be better off. So this idea of protectionism that we constantly have to be battling, my view is that whatever it takes in terms of representation, governmental representation, business representation in the United States, we have to further up our game because our interests are so huge. They have to know who we are. Even last week in Washington, some very prominent American leaders all began by saying, well, you know, you are our best friends and our closest allies, but then they started talking about the Ukraine or talking about China. So only to say that this effort at getting noticed and respected is a never-ending cause, but we have to do even better than we have. Secondly, falling back on this idea of the continent. If the continent is able to work together, we will be a formidable force in relation to India, China, the European Economic Union. And look, and the only other thing we can do, frankly, is get down on our knees at night, Howard, and pray. Because the dysfunctionality that we see in the United States right now, in my view, is so serious. Some people talk about civil war. We are now on the brink of a default, which they're going to try to negotiate quite literally at the 11th hour, with the potential of default and the catastrophic consequences, which it's sort of like when I was in Washington last week, I had the feeling that I was reading, you know, those books on leading up to the First World War. People sleepwalk to catastrophe. So it's really important. However, at the end of the day, the United States will respect us only if we have a strong economy. You know, we're at 50 million people now. We'll be at 75 million people before that long. We have to spend more on defense. We have to make sure that we're an attractive place to invest. All of those things that buttress our independence, which would win us respect, not only from the United States, but from other parts of the world. As you saw from the book, I'm a nationalist. I've never, even though I was a strong supporter of free trade, I never believed that becoming, you know, the next state was either desirable or that we should even be the wealthy suburb of the Great Republic. To me, a strong Canada is how we win respect in the world, starting with the Americans.
One last one, and then we'll go to some questions. Please put some questions in chat for Tom. Tom, what do you think the legacy of the council is? I mean, it's, you know, you started there, well, you were an advisor beginning in 1977, became CEO in 81. Now we're in 2023. That's, you know, 4+ decades. What is the legacy? What are the things that stand out briefly?
Well, Howard, I'd say, first of all, from a business history point of view, we were the first CEO organization dedicated to a comprehensive program of public policy reform in Canadian history. So that is certainly a first. And we also were the first organization that said the role of business is not just simply to maximize shareholder value, as per the great economist Martin Friedman, but that we should reach out to stakeholders. In 81, when I gave my maiden speech to the council, CEOs that meddled in public policy were looked upon as skewed. I mean, you know, you were not tending to your knitting. So getting this idea across that we can contribute to the shaping of a better country was an important part of that legacy. Thirdly, that the real purpose of capital is not just to build more capital and wealth, but the ultimate purpose of capital is to build a better society. And that if we're able to do that, you know, when people say to me about what about the retention of capitalism, it's the same argument that Martin Wolf is making in his excellent current book, that if capitalism wants to survive, we have to be smart, we have to be social investors, we have to align what we do with national goals and international goals. And if we do that, capitalism will have a long, long life. If we get into it's all about us and it's all for us, I always remind people, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, what happens is when people are unhappy or people are not well, if people are poor, they rise up in the populist revolts that we're seeing, that exemplified by Donald Trump and on the left in the United States, and we're seeing in Britain and in other parts of Europe. These are people who are unhappy. Still, the scorched fire, the scorched earth effect of the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where out of it, very few people who were instrumental in the crisis paid a price or were punished for it. But hundreds of millions, billions of people were saddled with public debt, which is part and parcel what is feeding populism today. So all I'm really saying is our legacy, I think, fundamentally is it's not just about shareholder value. Align yourself independently and in a nonpartisan way, strict nonpartisanship, with goals, whether they be provincial goals, national goals, international goals, that will lead to a better world and a better society. And at the same time, work your butts off to make your companies highly successful. That to me is the legacy that we started to build, and which under Goldie Hyder's leadership today is the current CEO of the council, who I think is a brilliant communicator, very strong in organization. And based on I attend all the meetings of the council, the degree of engagement now is very high, and people are enthusiastic, and they realize that the past role that I've written about and our future success will be determined by how successful we are as business people and also as contributors to a better society.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. Let me just go to, thank you very much. Let me go to the chat and see, do we have any questions in chat yet, Mark? I'm not seeing. I guess everybody's been listening very intently, because I have lots more. If you want me to ask a few more while we get some in the queue, obviously there are certain current issues, Tom, like when you came in as CEO, the National Energy Program had just come in, and of course that was a very, very tense period in terms of constitutional issues in this country and Western alienation. Now we're seeing, I think it's fair to say, a certain demonization of oil and gas industry because of the fossil fuel contributions to climate issues. Yet at the same time, it's a huge part of Canadian GDP. Alberta, it's the centerpiece of Albertan industry and the Albertan economy, and we're seeing Western alienation again. How serious an issue do you see that now, based on what you saw in the 80s?
Well, it's very serious now, but I cannot emphasize strongly enough how serious it was in the early 80s. Peter Lougheed, who I write about in the book, certainly one of my mentors, close friend and colleague, in many respects exemplified, that reaction, Western reaction of a resource-based economy against domination from the East. And in my book, I talk about how we brought together the CEOs of producing and consuming companies, along with the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta, and along with the then Federal Minister of Energy, who happened to be a man called Jean Chrétien. And we met at Niagara-on-the-Lake, decided that there was a way of bringing the country together, and that is that we would slowly go to world price, but not do it overnight. But in the process, agree on a set of policies that could make the then energy industry work better for the country. And in the context of today, I would say that the alienation is still very, very strong. It's very evident to me because I'm very active in Alberta as a business advisor to the Business Council of Alberta. It's still very, very strong. And part of the reason I put at the foot of the current federal government that seems reluctant to talk about our great resource patrimony. The speech of the throne, to my knowledge, did not even mention the words oil and gas. Now, there is a chapter on the environment where we played a very active role, and we're still active in the environment of the council, that says, of course, we must move to greater sustainability, but at the same time, we have to be reasonable about the transition. We're not going to get to 100% electric cars by 2030, nor are we going to get to zero emissions easily by 2050. So these people who argue, shut down the fossil fuel industry today, and some of them even had, let's shut down the nuclear industry as well, having shut down coal, how on earth are we going to survive as a people? So bringing rationality back to the debate, while still moving in a direction that acknowledges that lesser reliance on fossil fuels and greater reliance on renewable energy is the way we want to go. And you know what, Howard? Canada, and I've argued this in the book, Canada could have been and still could be not only an environmental superpower, but an energy superpower if environment and energy are seen to be a symbiotic relationship. And that means, for example, on the critical issue of transition, let's be realistic about what we can do here. And that means you have to do it over time. You just don't do it tomorrow.
So that is a controversial one, all of that. And the question we have in the queue is also a controversial one. It's from Mark, actually. How do you, Tom, how do you respond to those who say business attitudes are too quote unquote woke today, focused on social issues and not on business issues? Tricky one, I realize.
Right. I would never use the word woke to associate the word woke with a highly intelligent, very carefully thought out program on the part of businesses to maximize their effectiveness wherever they are. If you're Rio Tinto or you're tech, clearly wherever you're operating as a leading mining organization, you have to be sensitive to the environment. You have to be sensitive to the safety of your workers. To do neither means that you're shooting yourself in both feet. That's not what I call woke. Shooting yourself in both feet is just stupid. What you have to be able to do is generate growth in your business by giving the chances of your business being more successful wherever they are operating. The woke agenda I tend to associate, with those who say capitalism is done. We already all this stuff about ESG and zero net zero by 50 commitments. This is all a great charade on the part of business. They're not really serious about it. That is a woke argument. But talk to any. Let me put it this way: any CEO who does not recognize how important it is to be a player societally is, in my view, a failure as a CEO. I don't know that we can, other than in totalitarian autocratic countries where there is no democracy, in any developed country, can we really identify an individual who says, you know what, Tom, it's all about shareholder value, and anybody who plays in that other sandpit that has to do with keeping our streets safe, looking after our workforce, ensuring that the health of our workforce is fine, protecting the environment. Those who neglect that sort of thing aren't in that job for very long. That's a reality. It's not woke. That's intelligence.
Thank you for that. Let me go to another one, Tom. This is from Dimitri Anastakis. Hi, Dimitri. And he says, thank you for your insightful and important remarks, Tom. In the 1980s, how much did practicalities of the dominant role of the U.S. and the Canada-U.S. trade relationship play in shaping the views of CEOs versus an ideological belief in free trade? In other words, how much of the decision to embrace free trade was one of economic survival?
Oh, I would say that the argument about economic survival was very, very strong. All the original arguments that I made and that my colleagues embraced from day one were that we had no choice. At the time that the free trade agreement started to be kicked around, the US was going increasingly protectionist, right? And here we were, a largely natural-based, resource-based economy on the above the northern border, facing a country that our jobs, our prosperity depended entirely on it, yet it was going decidedly in the direction of protectionism. And so the rationale was, how do we get under the protectionist umbrella to ensure that our interests will not be fatally damaged? So it was, in answer to Dimitri, it was definitely driven by a real concern that we were just simply going to remain hewers of wood and drawers of water, and nothing much more. There was definitely a fear factor at work. However, the ideology was not unimportant, because remember, Dimitri, this was a time of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. I would argue that Milton Friedman's certainly was riding high. So the idea of a revolution in economic thinking was very popular then, as you know, or I should say very popular. It was highly controversial, but at the very least, it achieved a status where a lot of people said, you know what, that's right. Enough of this hard-baked socialism, enough of too much government intervention. Let's unleash enterprise. And that had a great degree of appeal. I would argue it still has a great deal of appeal, but fear was definitely a factor.
You know, we're getting close to the end, Tom, and I just wanted to ask one question to bring it full circle, because we started with your upbringing and your folks. I know your dad died suddenly when you were just 19. What do you think he would say now if we were looking at the world that you've seen and you've experienced?
Well, I don't think, having died when he did, I don't think he could even imagine the world that we're living in right now. But the one thing I can tell you, I think I can say with some degree of humility, he would probably say, thank you for always standing up for what you believe in and not being a compromiser. And I use that word. Compromise could be a very useful thing, as you know, but standing up for ideas that you believe in, values, he would say, thank God you did that. The second thing you would probably say, I'm sorry you didn't go on to practice law. You might have been a hugely successful lawyer. And who knows, you might even be a justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. I had nothing against people in business. He himself was a small businessman. And I think the third thing he would say is, I'm glad you worked hard, that you married well. I have a very smart wife who's been my lifetime companion, to which I dedicate the book. I call her my North Star, who spent 17 years in the Department of Finance and in PCO and ended up as a deputy minister. So all of that, when I was asked by Steve Paikin not too long ago, do you have any regrets? The answer is I don't have any regrets, but I wasn't quick enough to answer Steve by saying the following. One regret I have is that, having studied the violin quite seriously, that I have not been able to achieve the status where I can play Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D with a full symphony orchestra. That is one great regret I have. And I said that to Yo-Yo Ma on one occasion when I met him, when he said, have you studied music? And I said, I have studied the violin. And he said, why did you give it up? And that's when I told him that my great wish still was to practice the violin concerto in D and play it in front of a paid audience that I would have to bring to the National Arts Center, because they wouldn't come on their own, to hear me play that violin concerto. Anyway, that's my only regret for the moment.
Well, that's a great way to finish. And I have one little surprise. There's another violin player on the call. My mother is on the call. She's going to be 95. I'm outing you here, Mom, in October. And she still practices the violin every night, Tom. So you've got time. You're a young man, relatively speaking. You can go at it. She's waving at you. Anyway, that was great, Tom. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And thanks again to our sponsor, National Bank Financial. We couldn't do it without you, and the whole staff of the Canadian Business History Association for the work that you do to make this possible. The next talk in our series will be on June 8th at 5 p.m. It's entitled Building on the Past to Secure a Future Rooted in Innovation, with Eva Lau and Richard C. And you can attend either in person, this one at Rotman, room L 1025, or online. And if you want to, please register on the CBHA-ACHA website. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Hope you have a great day, and see you next time. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.